We love the idea of villains, not because we're bloodthirsty, but because a villain makes the story simple. If the worst things in history were done by monsters, then the question of how you would have behaved doesn't even arise. And here's the problem with that. Hannah Arendt sat across a glass partition from one of the architects of the Holocaust for months. She watched him, she listened to him, she took notes. And what she came back to report disturbed people. Not because it was monstrous, but because it wasn't. She did not find a monster. She found something harder to process than a monster. And what she found changed the entire question, not just about what happened in mid-century Europe, but about what's happening right now, inside the institutions you inhabit. The company you work for, the church you belong to, the civic organizations, the social circles, the family systems you've been part of for 30 years. The question she came back with wasn't, how do evil people do evil things? It was something that keeps people up at night once they really hear it. How do ordinary, decent people end up doing or allowing things they would have refused if you described them in advance? We're gonna get there. But first, I need to clear away the version of this idea you've almost certainly heard. Because if you start with the wrong map, you'll arrive at the wrong place. You've heard the phrase, the banality of evil. It entered the language. It's quoted in graduation speeches and op-eds and documentary films. And here is what most people understand it to mean. That evil is ordinary, that it's everywhere, that average people are capable of terrible things, that there's a little Eichmann in all of us. That reading is not wrong, exactly. But it's blunt where Arendt was precise. And the precision is the thing that matters, because precision is what produces a tool you can actually use. Arendt wasn't making a claim about human nature in the abstract. She was making a claim about a specific mechanism, one she watched operate in one specific man and then recognized everywhere once she knew what to look for. Adolf Eichmann was not a fanatic. That's the first thing that startled her. He wasn't driven by a burning hatred of Jewish people. He wasn't particularly ideological. He wasn't, by any of the conventional measures, a psychopath. What she observed and documented in Eichmann in Jerusalem, published in 1963, was someone who couldn't formulate a thought in his own words. When he spoke, he produced clichés, official language, bureaucratic formulas. When she pressed him, beneath the formulas there was nothing, no personal conviction, no articulated belief, no genuine reflection on what he was actually doing. He had, Arendt concluded, stopped thinking, not in the sense of being stupid. Eichmann was competent. He organized logistics across a continent. He navigated bureaucratic hierarchies with skill. The thinking he had stopped doing was of a different kind. What Arendt, drawing on Socrates, would later describe as the internal conversation in which you ask yourself, is what I am doing right? Not by the rules of the system. Not by the approval of your superiors. By your own conscience, applied to the actual thing in front of you. That faculty, the one that makes you a person rather than a function, Eichmann had either surrendered or let atrophy. And the system he operated inside made it not just easy to stop, but actively rewarded him for stopping. Every step up the ladder required a little more insulation from the specific human consequences of his decisions. Every promotion moved the paperwork further from the freight car. The design of the institution made the thinking unnecessary, and eventually made it threatening. This is what Arendt called Gedankenlosigkeit, thoughtlessness. Not stupidity, not malice, a specific, cultivated absence. The decision, repeated thousands of times in small moments, to let the institution do the moral reasoning so you don't have to. Now, hold that idea for a moment, because there's a piece of evidence that most people who've heard of Arendt have never connected to her, even though the connection is direct and documented. In 1961, while the Eichmann trial was underway in Jerusalem, a psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram was conducting a series of experiments that would become among the most famous and disturbing in the history of social science. He recruited ordinary American adults, men from New Haven, people who'd answered a newspaper ad, and placed them in a room with an authority figure in a white coat and a switchboard. They were told administered electric shocks to another person in the next room. They could hear the person responding, first discomfort, then distress, then screaming, then silence. The switches were labeled in increments up to XXX danger, severe shock. 65% of participants administered what they believed was the maximum voltage, all the way to the end, simply because the authority figure in the white coat said, calmly, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue." Milgram cited Arendt directly. He was, in part, testing her thesis, not as philosophy, but as a measurable, replicable psychological phenomenon. What he found was that the mechanism she identified in one bureaucrat in one totalitarian regime was not a product of German culture, or of wartime conditions, or of a particular political system. It was a feature of the relationship between individuals and institutional authority, period. The white coat was enough. The reassurance that someone else was responsible, that the system had designed this, that there were rules in place, that your role was only to follow them, was enough to get ordinary, decent people to do something they would have refused with horror if you'd asked them in a different context. This is the mechanism, not villainy, not ideology, not hatred. The delegation of moral judgment to a structure that absorbs it and returns nothing. Before I go further, if what you're thinking about right now is less abstract than philosophy and more concrete than you expected, there's something in the description worth knowing about. I put together a reference called Dark Times, a quote swipe file with commentary. It's 50 of Arendt's most precise formulations, the ones that give you language for things you've been feeling but couldn't name, each with a plain English commentary on what she actually meant and why it's relevant now. It's organized by theme: forgiveness, freedom, loneliness, action, legacy. It's the kind of thing you read slowly, over time, when you want to think rather than scroll. The link is in the description. So here's the question the research produces, and the one I promised you at the start. How do you know if you're currently inside a system that is quietly compromising your moral judgment? This isn't a hypothetical for most people who've reached their 50s. You've had a career. You've belonged to institutions. You've watched colleagues get promoted for the exact thing that made you uncomfortable and said nothing. You've sat in a meeting where everyone in the room knew something was wrong, and the silence was louder than any of the presentations. You've maybe stayed in a church or an organization long past the moment when you stopped believing in what it was doing, because leaving felt like admitting something you weren't ready to name. I'm not here to tell you those decisions were wrong. Life is complex, and the calculus of when to stay and when to leave is never as clean as it sounds in a philosophy lecture. What I want to give you are 3 specific things to look for. Not to judge the past, but to see the present clearly. The first is this: you find yourself explaining your organization's actions to yourself using its own language. Not your language, theirs. You say things like, "Well, the policy is designed to," or "the board decided and it's not really my place to," or "the leadership has a vision and I trust the process." None of those phrases are wrong on their own, but when they become your primary mode of moral reasoning, when you can no longer generate a sentence that begins, "I think this is wrong," because you have stopped thinking in the Arendtian sense, you have delegated the function. The second, the costs of speaking are always concrete and visible, and the costs of silence are always abstract and distant. This is how institutions maintain the silence. You can see exactly what happens to the person who raises the objection, the awkward meeting, the quiet exclusion, the performance review that goes differently than expected. The costs of complicity are harder to see because they accumulate slowly in your own moral self-understanding over years. Institutions are very good at making the first cost vivid and the second cost invisible. Arendt's argument is that the second cost is the one that matters, the third and the hardest to name. You feel more loyalty to the people inside the system than to the principles the system claims to embody. This one is human and understandable. Your colleagues are real people, and the principles are abstractions. But it's also, Arendt would argue, precisely the inversion that makes ordinary participation in extraordinary harm possible. The people are what you can see. The principles are what you swore to. Now here's the inversion that the whole video has been building toward. And it's the one that may make you uncomfortable in a way the 3 warning signs didn't. In Responsibility and Judgment, a collection of essays and lectures that Arendt gave in the years after the Eichmann controversy, she makes a distinction that most people who invoke her name never mention. She argues strongly against the concept of collective guilt. You cannot hold a people responsible. You cannot hold a generation responsible. You cannot hold an institution responsible in any morally meaningful sense. Moral responsibility, Arendt insists, is always and only individual. And here is why that's not reassuring, even though it sounds like it might be. If collective guilt doesn't exist, if you can't spread the responsibility across a system until it's thin enough that no individual feels any of it, then the only place responsibility actually lives is in the person, in you. in the specific moment when you chose or chose not to exercise the faculty of moral judgment that the system was designed to make unnecessary. This means the question the video has been building toward is not, how do you identify the bad people and systems so you can distinguish yourself from them? The question is, what are you not asking yourself right now, inside the system you're in? Not Eichmann's system. Not a historical atrocity. Your system. The one you're in on Monday morning. The one that has a culture and a hierarchy. And a set of unspoken rules about what kinds of concerns get raised and what kinds get career-limiting responses. Arendt isn't asking whether you're a good person, she's asking whether you're thinking. Because, as she argued in Thinking and Moral Considerations, those are not the same thing. You can be a decent person by every social measure and still have stopped asking yourself, from inside your own conscience, whether what you are doing is right. The thinking is the only thing that keeps the conscience operational. And the thinking is the thing that institutions, by design, not by malice, make it easiest to stop. There is a biographical fact about Arendt that belongs here, because it isn't just context, it's an argument. In 1963, the same year Eichmann in Jerusalem was published in book form, Arendt was effectively cancelled by a significant portion of the intellectual and Jewish community that had previously embraced her. Gershom Scholem, one of the most respected Jewish scholars of the 20th century and someone she had considered a friend, wrote her an open letter accusing her of lacking love for her own people, of a coldness, a detachment that he found morally offensive in the context of writing about the Holocaust. She wrote back, "The letter is measured and precise and worth reading in full." But the core of her response was this. She loved her friends. She did not love abstractions. She had never claimed to love the Jewish people as an entity, any more than she loved humanity in the abstract. Love, she argued, is always for particulars. And her obligation to the truth of what she had observed, however painful, however unwelcome, was not something she could subordinate to the social and communal pressures of belonging. The friendships she lost over that book were real. The community she was expelled from, the one that had welcomed her when she arrived in New York as a stateless refugee who'd been held in a French internment camp, was real. The cost of maintaining independent thought inside a system that pressures conformity is always real, always concrete, always paid by a specific person. What she modeled was not heroism in the cinematic sense. It was simply the refusal to stop thinking, even when the thinking cost her the belonging she had built over a lifetime. I want to leave you with the thing that Arendt found most hopeful in all of this, because it would be a betrayal of her to leave you only with the diagnosis. She believed, argued clearly in multiple works, that the capacity for thinking was available to everyone, not as a talent, not as an education, as a practice. The Socratic question she describes in Thinking and Moral Considerations isn't a philosophical method reserved for academics. It's the internal conversation that any person can choose to hold at any moment about any decision. Is this what I would choose to do if no one were watching? Is this consistent with the person I believe myself to be? Is the reason I'm doing this a real reason, or is it the institution speaking through me? That conversation, that small daily act of demanding your own accounting, is what she means by thinking. And it's the only thing, she would argue, that functions as a genuine defense against the mechanism she watched Eichmann embody. It doesn't require leaving your job. It doesn't require a dramatic public stand. It requires, to begin with, only that you stop delegating the question. The world we share is built by what people do in ordinary moments when no one is grading them. History's worst chapters weren't written in single dramatic decisions by obvious monsters. They were written in 10,000 small moments when someone decided it wasn't their job to think about it today. That's the Arendt argument. Not that we're all capable of evil in some abstract sense, that the specific mechanism, the one she watched operate, the one Milgram measured, runs on nothing more dramatic than the suspension of a question you could ask yourself right now. If you've ever looked back at a job, a church, a family system, and wondered why you stayed quiet when you knew something was wrong, tell me what made it easier not to speak.